you might be designing something for children, you might be designing something for someone in a country that you don't live in. So it's a huge part of the process to understand what people's genuine experiences are, what their genuine needs and desires are, and what they really want and need out of a product.
Welcome to the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast. I'm your regular host, Nate Cooper, and with me this season, I have Eve McKnight as my co-host. This season of Cut Your Learning Curve is sponsored by Swarm NYC, a digital product design agency and management consultancy. Swarm helps you connect the dots and mitigate the risks associated with launching a digital product, website, or idea. Thanks for joining me, Eve. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eve McKnight. I teach about project management all over the United States with my company, Little Owl, and I'm also the Director of Learning here at Swarm.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me, Eve. If you're new to the podcast, Cut Your Learning Curve is where we help you rethink how you can learn new skills that benefit your professional career and the projects that you want to develop. So let's jump into the episode. We are doing our second guest interview. So Claire Haar is a product design manager here at Swarm. And before transitioning into product design and product management, Claire worked in the related realms of visual design, research, marketing, and business development. Throughout her career, she has worked with companies of all sizes and has worked as a designer in an agency setting, as a freelancer, as a business owner, and in-house. Prior to joining Swarm, Claire led the in-house marketing team at construction management company Turner International and their New York City headquarters, where she provided strategic brand management services to align their marketing and business development objectives globally. So thank you for joining us, Claire.
Thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Thanks for being our second guinea pig, too. We have some questions, and mainly we don't have an audience this time, but I think Eve and I came up with a barrage of things. Hopefully it won't put you too much on the spot, Claire, but we'd love to learn a little bit more about your background and your experiences and what it's like working here at Swarm. So why don't we start there? Claire, tell us about your role here at Swarm.
Yeah, so at Swarm, I am a product design manager. So the work that I do takes many forms. A lot of it is what is considered typically UI or UX design and research, as well as folding in the other parts of product design that are more about representing the client's goals and business opportunities and objectives, and how do we balance out the two. So whereas a UI UX person might be focused more about the experience of the user, what does the end user really need and want, and what's going to make their life better, we do that, and also we look at opportunities for the client, and we customize all of our solutions to that client specifically and help them see things that they may not understand initially or may not know coming in before we do the discovery.
Thanks, Claire. I think it's really interesting, the balance you just talked about, and I know we're going to dive into that in a minute as well. Before we get there, I know you just mentioned the terms UI, UX design. Do you think you could explain that to folks who've maybe aren't really familiar with that terminology?
For sure, yeah. So UX is user experience, UI is user interface. Basically, the experience can be more about the user flow. How does the user get from one place to another? What sort of information or visual cues do they need in order to understand the information and move forward and achieve whatever their goal is? And then there's also usually a large component of research involved in UX UI. So it is, first of all, taking a step back to ask, are we really solving the right problems? Are we asking the right questions? What are the real needs of the user? And then how do we workshop solutions so that we're providing something that works and is also hopefully enjoyable to use? So that's a quick summary of UX, UI, and kind of what that is traditionally about. And then in terms of workflow, once you've done that initial discovery, you move forward with prototyping and wireframing solutions and designs. and you do a fair bit of testing and design validation before you move on to making high fidelity mock-ups or those really beautiful designs, which is often where graphic designers start. They might start with making something look amazing, incorporating illustrations, whereas that's more of the sort of final step for UX and UI design.
Thanks, Claire. I know we're going to move there in a minute. I think also just what's so interesting, even again, as we're just starting, like, I don't really think people well, I don't know how much people care in the first place, but certainly your typical user, how much they really give thought to, how did somebody design this product that I'm interfacing with, either mobile, which is touch, of course, or on a website where, you're using something like a mouse of some kind. And the kind of thought that's put into literally, how do we take you through this journey to buy shoes, to play a game, to invest in stock in Robinhood? And that field really has come into its own in the last 20 years or so. It certainly wasn't really predominant in the maybe late 20th century, but really since 2000, 2001, really it's kicked off since. So Nate?
Well, did you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has become more important as we realize what an impact bad design has. So that has kind of led companies, especially in Silicon Valley, to bring in designers earlier and earlier into the process. So rather than saying, hey, this is the thing we want to build, let's build it and then see how it works, the earlier you can get designers in there, especially product designers who are aware of different sort of frameworks to analyze business opportunities, the earlier you can work those into the designs, the better impact you can have, also for the user. So I think also the impact, we've seen the impact on when products are badly designed, especially for the older generation, maybe your parents or your grandparents. What they tend to do is when they can't work out how to use an app or a phone or a website, whatever the technology is, when they can't work out how to use it, they don't think that it might be a bad design. They blame themselves. And in the worst case, they might think that there's no place for them in this modern society of 2021, and they feel really disconnected from the world, and that's horrible. So really, as UX UI designers and as product designers, we are here to represent and advocate for the user in a way that they are not able to do for themselves. They are not aware of what technologies go into building these products, and we are. So we need to represent their interests so that they don't feel like they don't have a place in society. So I think that's sort of what has come to the forefront of people's minds in the past 10, 20 years.
I think I'll jump into Nate in a second, but certainly the impression that came to mind for me was I teach at New York University and I do a lot of case study work. And back in the caucuses, so I guess that was 2020, 2019. No, of course not. It was 2019. 2020, 2019, right? Everything was kicking off with COVID. There was this app to determine the Iowa caucus, such a big deal. And, they were trying to balance different concerns. And one of their term concerns was top security. However, they didn't really talk to people in the tech field about what are best practices with security. And there were some issues with procurement. But one of the interesting things to me was basically because they were so late with their timeline, they expected these volunteers, average age 65 and higher, to sideload an app into their iTunes, into their phones, into their cell phones. And, like you're saying, like, I just thought it was really interesting. This was also related to sort of the technical failings, but, from a just overall, how is the user going to use this? Anyone with a real expertise, sort of like I think Claire's talking about today, would easily take a step back. And for your target audience, these volunteers, this is just going to be very unmanageable for them. They also didn't include really good directions on how to sideload or jailbreak your phone, which you're not supposed to do in the first place. And I thought that was just, and they didn't come up with any kind of workaround. And ultimately what ended up happening, in a celebration of security is people screenshot the information and then just emailed it to people, or they just sent it in over the phone and the phones weren't staffed correctly. So it was such a boondoggle from end to end. But, again, really thinking about how is our user, in this case, a very specific audience who frankly doesn't need a lot of data, but needs a lot of pretty straightforward explanation of something they're really only going to use for one evening. It's not something they're going to have in their pocket for a year. There's just all these very specific conditions in play. So that just reminded me of it. Anyway, I'm sure Nate has thoughts on this since this is his area of specialty. So Nate.
Well, it's a little different, but I mean, it reminded me of when I used to teach adults myself. Because I found that same experience that you just mentioned, Claire. Like people tend to blame themselves when technology isn't working, and how good product design, it's often judged by how invisible it is. So and the flip side of that is that like it's sometimes difficult. I find, and I don't know if you agree with this, but sometimes it's hard to communicate the value of why invest in design. I think people people in a business, looking to build, say, like a website or an app, like they often just say, well, we just want the design to look, we just want it to, can you just build a design, can you just design it, like, and they don't know what the process is. And I think you've unraveled some of the layers there where you mentioned kind of the difference between user experience and UI. But you know it's hard to conceive of those practices existing in a bubble for those of us who work in there, whereas I think for many people outside of it, they just see the result. And so, one of the questions I had for you, Claire, was just like, how do you see bridging that gap, like for a company, let's say, that needs to build a product? Like, why should companies care about making good designs or improving the user experience?
Yeah, I think it's not about making an objectively best product. It's about making a product that is customized for your user and for your business needs, and finding that perfect sort of middle point where it works for everyone. And the other part of design is that because the end result is largely invisible, if we've done our job well, no one knows that we did our job, basically. So, so in that sense, it's difficult sometimes for clients to see the value of design, what the process actually is, and what value is brought by going through that process of designing. Human-centered design is very important for improving people's quality of life, as we've sort of touched on. So I think a good analogy is if you think about how a client might come to an architect, they don't come in and say, hey, I've designed this building, give me one engineer and some construction people. Like that, um, they wouldn't assume that they can do what an architect does, but sometimes there are, what I guess the value that we bring is that we understand a lot of things that are factors, as well as how to make that end result. So if we go back to the architect analogy, a client comes in with a parcel of land and they have some idea about who the end user is. So maybe they need a school, so students need certain types of classrooms or a gym. Maybe it's an office, and these type of workers need these types of spaces in that office. But before that, you need to look at the parcel of land. Excuse me. You need to look at the parcel of land, and you need to say, well, okay, what is the soil composition? What is the closest river or source of groundwater? Where are the roads? Where do we need street access? What is the sun path? Because any one of these things might impact the final design in a significant way. And if you were saying, okay, I like this design of this school over here, let's just copy that and put it on this piece of land, even if the sun path is different, that might lead to, say, 30% increase in maintenance costs for the electricity use of that building. So that's the value that designers bring, that is not immediately clear to the client, even if they do understand sort of the processes of how do we get from design to engineering to construction. It's also, the sooner you get people in a room together at the start of the project, then you get a wider variety of experiences, you get a wider risk assessment, and you can collaborate on solutions before you start taking steps down a certain path towards a solution.
I have lots of thoughts on this one, I have to say. So just first of all, and Nate knows this about me because we've been doing podcasts for a while. I particularly love comparing skyscrapers to software development because they are so different. And like first of all, I thought that was a really great explanation, Claire. What's really interesting, of course, about if you deal with a client who's dealing with an architect, dealing with a physical space, is how you make a building has not changed that much in a century or two, and skyscrapers specifically 1940s, 1950s. So we're looking at 60 or 70 years of knowledge. Very consistent. You were talking about the sun path, soil, that jazz just doesn't change. So soil might change a little. The sun path really doesn't change unless climate change goes to a whole new level that I don't even know about, where they like tilt the earth or something, but I don't think that's a real thing. Anyway, and so, what's interesting too, is you were talking about the duration of building. Again, a skyscraper is years. It's also something you could physically see. And for our work, while it is actually the same set of how do we think about serving our users, it's all this, first of all, very abstract stuff that has to happen in an incredibly accelerated timeline. And so I think that is actually part of why, like, everybody knows what an architect does, right? Like, it's very known. It's a very well lobbied, well-defined industry. And, when you start to talk about UI, UX, and actually the entire graphic design space, it just gets harder to articulate this. So I would totally agree on that level in terms of sort of the project type. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting is you were talking about value of good design. I think that's where we started, is I would actually posit that inside the tech world, specifically startups, design is highly valued. It could be that everybody's copying Apple to a certain extent, again, this century. But, when you think about your typical tech startup these days, very low overhead, a handful of people, typically a head of sales and a head of product. And then operations, sort of my boat, tends to come much, much later. And there's often this push and pull between, are we going to give up on some of the sort of loose and crazy practices that we used to have, like the weed dealer arriving at the office, to become like a real office and, deal with standard operating procedures and all of this. And it's just usually not illegal substances, but it's a very common pain point in these growth of organizations. So it's interesting to me. I do think there's something different, though, if you're in this space, a tech space, and you're trying to convince maybe, which is an area Swarm works in, a more traditional industry, a player that's been around for a while, about why design specifically for product you cannot like hold in your hands. You can hold an iPad, but you can't really hold software or a mobile app in your hands, and to get their heads around the same set of ideas and the value to users. So I think there's actually sort of a difference of this value depending on what industry you're in. So I think that part's very interesting as well. Nate?
Well, Claire, what do you think? I mean, how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because the term product design can be synonymous with industrial design. And in that case, it is specifically about a three-dimensional physical object that's being designed. So it's easier for people to understand, oh, if it's an apple peeler, I need to be able to hold it in my hand comfortably. So what is required is a little more obvious and less abstract because you're dealing with a physical object. But I think that it has also, again, in kind of startup land, has become more crucial to have well-rounded designers early in the process, because not all of the products are simply digital products either. They're not just an app. They're not just a website. Some of them are paired with physical products or experiences. So like a camera would be part hardware, part software, and then you need an app for the person to control it. So also something like an app that has a physical component. Maybe it's a fitness app, or maybe it's Airbnb. So they understand that every user experience, whether it is the host or a guest, everyone starts with an online experience, but then everyone transitions into an in-person experience. And Airbnb as a company cares a lot about how the in-person experience goes, how their customer service functions. And so it's not just about the digital design and the UX of the app. It's also about how that connects with the rest of the company, and how to look at the holistic user experience. And especially if you have different types of users, like a host versus a guest, they have wildly different needs. So how do you balance everything that's required for the users, whether it is digital and or physical?
Yeah, and actually, I think what's interesting as well that you mentioned earlier, right, is how do we both, and you talked about this. First of all, I'd like to say, as somebody who stepped from more of the industrial space into the tech space, I think you're particularly well suited to talk about this, Claire. But I also think what's interesting is, you mentioned earlier about how is it customized for your users and your business needs. And it's incredibly hard to do both, right? Like there's a real business short-term economic value in making an app frictionless and making it more sticky, meaning people want to spend more time on it. This can lead to all kinds of unintended consequences. Plus, not for nothing, simply because you did mention Airbnb, this week there was a nice piece about how I think they've done what they can for guests, but there's many hosts are talking about filing a class action suit because when Airbnb offered that everybody's cancellations would be refunded, all of these hosts lost thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars, depending on the host. And so it's actually quite hard to serve. And I think certainly being an Airbnb host isn't that different than being an Uber driver. In terms, the risks I think are far higher for, well, the risks in both. There's potential liability in both. Both I don't think are as protected as one would imagine. So there's real challenges there. But that said, in both cases, I feel like both Uber and Airbnb have really wonderful mobile apps / websites, and they really think about, okay, I'm a consumer and I want to walk through this experience. I'm looking for this type of thing. They've done all this great stuff. Uber has for like business riders, so they can really file all of their business expenses back home very easily with their home companies. Like there's just tons and tons of stuff there. So I definitely would see it that way.
Yeah, and I think since we're still talking about Airbnb, and it's interesting when they ran into a huge challenge that massively impacted their business and was completely out of their control. How did they respond to that? And aside from the whole refund issue, what they did was pivot into local experiences and less about hosting, but more, okay, well, what can people do digitally and or locally? How do we become more of a sort of activity experience sort of company rather than being solely about people hosting other people in their homes? So product design also lets you kind of understand where your business is now and evaluate different opportunities for risks and rewards.
So I think what you're arguing, maybe you would agree or not agree, Claire, is also that really robust product design can make you more flexible in terms of considering new options.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
I had a question that may be related to that because I'm just curious to hear your answer, Claire. What is the role of empathy in design?
Yeah, well, I think that you have to, as a designer, it's challenging because you are usually not the end user of the product. It's very unlikely that I will be designing something for only 30-something-year-old women. You might be designing something for children. You might be designing something for someone in a country that you don't live in. So it's a huge part of the process to understand what people's genuine experiences are, what their genuine needs and desires are, and what they really want and need out of a product. Because often, if you come at it from a place where, well, I'm an experienced designer, I can just make the best decisions, that tends to kind of get you in hot water because that in that case, you are not using any empathy to understand the end user of the product.
I think I would also add on to that. I mean, I think it sort of ties into what I was saying as well, is I imagine, Claire, there's this sort of first set of designs that we implement. And then obviously, and Claire and I have spent some time talking about sort of the deep dive of the different steps of the product design process. Once you do a second set of validation with users, there is the opportunity for change, right? Like you might go back and rewrite some of it, rewrite all of it. Is that fair statement?
Yeah. It's being flexible, and being willing to make adjustments at any stage of the process if information comes to light that is more accurate. So, if you do a subsequent research study and you find something out, like if you find a new opportunity or you uncover a new need or you've designed something, but then when you actually observe someone who is an end user using that product and you ask them to walk through it and they get stuck and they can't work out what to do, then really you need to improve the design at that point. You need to find a new solution. You need to workshop some other ideas, because the assumption that you made has proven to be false, which is fine. It's a process.
My bank has done a few refreshes of their website, to pay bills, that sort of thing. And certainly what's been striking to me over the few years that I've noticed it, you open up the website and all of a sudden the icons look different, is it's really been simplified. And they've done
Mm-hmm.
everything they can to kind of walk it through. I think they're targeting a specific demographic. And they just really make it like more visually accessible, fewer steps, but steps that are just really in these big font and really clean and easy to read. It's just been striking, and they've reduced the sort of, they've made it fat. They've sort of shortened the garden path, as they call it, to sort of executing what we're supposed, the set of tasks we are there to do as users. So I do think it's striking to see it also kind of evolve over time.
Yeah, especially if you're a designer in-house. So we at Swarm are in an agency setting. We work with multiple clients on multiple projects in multiple industries all at the same time. But if you're a designer in-house, then you can go really deep on who your end users are and what they need and how you can improve that over time, especially if you have a new type of user that comes on board and starts using your product, then they might need something else. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how apps and products develop over time. Really understanding the product life cycle is important. So is it something that we are launching right now? Is it like a new feature that has new technologies, like a watch party, or is it something where we have the site, we don't want to change any of the technology platforms or components, but it isn't functioning that well. Maybe it's just aesthetic changes that are needed. Um, or maybe it's information architecture. So maybe all the information is there, and but it's not in the right order. So people are not getting what they need when they need it. So there are all sorts of opportunities for improvement, and especially in-house, you can get really deep on that, and you probably are more likely to have a dedicated research person, which can separate out the research from the design, and then the researcher doesn't have as much potential for confirmation bias. If it's the designer who's also doing the research, then the questions that are asked and the way that the answers are interpreted might be at a risk of sort of confirmation bias or being not as objective as possible. So yeah, it's interesting to see how companies improve products over time, and I think it's it's largely done by in-house teams, but in an agency setting, we kind of jump in at any point and kind of work out where to go from here.
So one last question for you, Claire. And it's sort of two parts. I guess I'd be curious to know where your biggest challenges are, and maybe as part of that, you can explain, what does it take to do this job well, whether in your position or just kind of like from what you've seen work with your experiences in various places.
Yeah, I think there are definitely different backgrounds that product designers can come from. Um, Often UX, UI, and product design are treated as the same thing. One isn't necessarily more advanced or has a higher salary than the other. They're just sort of different roles with a lot of skills overlap. So a lot of product designers come from UX, UI, or research, but some more and more people are coming from more diverse backgrounds, whether that's marketing, business development, engineering backgrounds, whether it's a sort of graphic design or project management. Even former architects are really great product designers, product managers, product leads, because they have a really solid understanding of design objectively. Like, what is the value of design? How do you convey that to a client? So I think that is one challenge, is conveying and quantifying the value of design. And then I think also just we find that it's difficult sometimes to set the client up for success after the project. So helping the client to understand what they need after we launch a feature or come to the end of a scope of work is is a challenge as well. Because especially in an agency context, once we let that project go, sometimes they are responsible for it, and just helping them to understand what they need to continue evaluating the success of that product is very important. And you can do that in different ways, whether it's uh, qualitative research, for example, um, after launch, going back and interviewing some people who have used the product, who are actually, subscribers or end users of the product. And you can also quantify it with data. So qualitative and quantitative proof is kind of what you can use. And yeah, so if we set a client up with Google Analytics in the right way to track the right things, then that can also provide proof of the value of the work that we did in terms of real dollar value proof.
Yeah, great. Um, I mean, I think it's just interesting that it comes again. I'm not even a little surprised that it does come from a diversity of backgrounds. I think the product design role and the product role are just, which are, very much shades of each other. And it makes sense to me that it would come from different backgrounds, simply because, like you talked about, understanding design objectively and just seeing that larger value. There is something very, very abstract in this very specific way to think about a specific set. I know I use specific twice, but to understand these kinds of challenges, it takes a very interesting awareness, both of self, user, and business. I would say it was all that. So just to recap what we've been talking about today here at on our podcast with Claire here at Swarm, is we've discussed first sort of what is product design, and more specifically, how do we think about UI and UX design as well. We really talked about how there's this priority of making a product that is customized for your users and your business needs. We then dived into some of the challenges of communicating the value of good design, and how this can be tricky sometimes. We also discussed what is fundamentally the role of empathy in design, and how really do designers try to sort of see from the shoes of these end users, and as well as understanding the product lifecycle, excuse me. Finally, we dived into what are some of the challenges and what does it take to do this job well, and who is well qualified to do it. So, Nate?
Perfect. Yeah, this is very interesting. I mean, Claire, do you have any parting thoughts while we end this round of questioning?
Yeah, I think if you yourself are a designer, try to think about how you can also convey the value of the design, and that it is a problem-solving process, not just making things look pretty, which is sometimes what people think. But it's a process of research and problem-solving, workshopping solutions more than it is making something just kind of look good. So yeah, a lot goes into it, and I think the more that designers and especially product designers can convey the value of what they do, then the end result is that the end user is comfortable using the product. They don't feel stuck or frustrated or end up blaming themselves when they can't work out how to use something. And I think that's really important.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So I want to say big thanks to our guest, Claire. Thank you for your time today and answering a lot of questions around product design and giving some thoughts and insight. Thanks also to my co-host, Eve. Thank you for preparing all of the great questions. Eve, do you want to tell folks how to get in touch with you?
Oh, sure. So I do trainings here at Swarm, as well as if you go to littleowl.us, I also do trainings all over as well, specifically project and team management.
Perfect.
Thanks for tuning in to learn with us today. This has been the Cut Your Learning Curve podcast, sponsored by Swarm. Don't forget to go to swarmnyc.com/learn. There you can sign up for our email newsletter and connect with us on social media.
Thanks, Eve. And again, my name is Nate Cooper. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day and happy learning.